Horace Mann has been called the father of American public education, which I suppose would justify naming schools after him if he was in fact the father of American education. But it's a very strange kind of paternity, since schools had existed for 200 years before Mann came on the scene. Mann did not invent the idea of public schools. Mann did not found public schools in the United States or even in his own state of Massachusetts. According to Mann's critics, the public schools in his state had been doing just fine before he came on the scene. So what did Horace Mann do that ended up with so many people giving him so much credit around American public education? Well, I would argue that before Horace Mann's time, if we were to go back in time and visit public schools, they would look very strange and foreign to us. Horace Mann and his generation reshaped public schools so that by the time he was finished with his work, schools would be much more familiar with what we consider to be schools. Let me explain in a little more detail. First, before Mann's generation, schools were pretty marginal to the educational process. Churches and families had primary responsibility for educating children, and if they went to school a little bit on the side, that was fine. Today, when we say education, we really mean school. That's one of the changes that Horace Mann helped bring about. Before Mann, control of schools had been a very local and informal affair. A few people in a town or a neighborhood would get themselves elected as the school board. They'd hire one person to be the teacher in the one-room schoolhouse, and that was that. The state didn't have any role. Larger communities didn't have any role. Horace Mann essentially created state bureaucracies and state standards for education. Finally, Horace Mann saw the need to use schools to do more than just teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. He saw the need for what we call civic education, and that schools needed to help create citizens of this still new country, the United States, which he saw himself a part of. Mann was born in a small town in Massachusetts in 1796. He attended Brown University. He was admitted to the Massachusetts bar in 1823 and had no intention of doing anything about reforming education. He saw himself as a successful politician, and he got elected to public office and rose to be the president of the Massachusetts State Senate. As Senate president, he got a bill passed creating the Massachusetts State Board of Education and creating an office, the paid secretary of the board, who would not have any power, but who would be able to collect statistics and advocate for the role of schools. Having gotten the bill passed, he went on to other things, but the board's first chair, Edmund Dwight, came back to Mann and said, "You're so good at this, I want you to be the first secretary of the board." Mann thought about it for a while, and in the end decided to abandon a promising political career to take on what he said was the higher sphere of education and morals. And so from 1836 to 1848, he was secretary of the state board, and in that position pushed through a number of changes in education that moved schools to being much more the way we think of schools. He said, following Thomas Jefferson and others, nothing would be easier to demonstrate that a Republican form of government without intelligent people must be a madhouse. He saw schools creating citizens for this new democratic society in the United States. Horace Mann also argued passionately, and much more than Jefferson, that schools needed to be for all people. When he talked about common schools, he didn't mean schools for, quote, the common folk. He meant schools that would bring everybody together, because he said whatever their future position in life, poor children and rich children needed to know each other. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a successful democratic society. He argued for taxation for public schools. In fact, he said that the failure to pay taxes for public schools was morally wrong and was theft from the next generation. Sort of imagine some attorney general someplace coming around and bringing suit against people because they didn't pay their taxes because it was theft from the next generation. But that was Mann's argument. Schools needed to be well funded. Mann also spent a lot of time thinking about an issue that's still divisive in the schools today: how to deal with the issue of religion in the schools. Mann said, well, we could have an established church, but we've abolished that in the United States. We could say there's no discussion of religion in schools, but that would be unfair. Mann's solution was to say, well, let's have every school read the Bible without note or comment, and let every child make the decisions on their own. The problem with that, and that Mann never understood this problem, is that while many Protestants would agree with that, and Mann was reflecting his own Protestant background, for Catholics, you're supposed to read the Bible in light of the teachings of the Church. And so Catholics found what Mann saw as a very positive approach to be a direct attack on their communities and their religious beliefs. Mann also had a couple of other blind spots as an educator. He never understood how bureaucracies could take over the life of schools and really disempower teachers. And ironically, given his own political views, he failed to deal with the racial integration of schools, even though free blacks in Boston were pushing for it, even while he talked about schools bringing everybody together. Nevertheless, at the same time, I think it's important to realize how much Mann did reshape schools. He did one other important thing. He was the first public official to argue that teachers needed special education, needed an education to prepare them for their jobs. And he created a string of public schools for teachers, which are now the state colleges at the state of Massachusetts. So he founded Bridgewater State College and Framingham State College and those institutions. In 1848, after 12 years as secretary, he ran for Congress and served 2 terms as a radical abolitionist, attacking slavery. And after that went on to be president of Antioch College, a new college in Ohio, which was the first college to admit blacks and whites on equal standing and women and men on equal standing. Oberlin had admitted women, but they were not given the same curriculum. At Antioch, Mann played out his commitment to bring everybody together. So it's important not to romanticize him, but I think it is important to understand credible contribution of a generation of people for whom Mann was only the most famous and perhaps the best speaker, that fundamentally shaped schools so that today we see this kind of schools that we have.